stood at the tall windows of Kensington Palace, watching the morning light filter through the ancient glass. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the letter that had arrived just hours before. The elegant handwriting belonged to her private secretary, but the words contained within carried a weight that made her chest tighten with emotion. The letter detailed the latest reports from the children's hospital she had been quietly supporting for the past 3 years. What the public didn't know, what even some of her closest staff members were unaware of, was that her involvement with the hospital went far beyond ceremonial visits and charity galas. It was deeply personal, rooted in a secret she had carried for most of her adult life. As she read through the statistics about childhood mental health struggles, each number felt like a punch to her stomach. The rates of anxiety and depression among children had skyrocketed in recent months. Self-harm cases were increasing at an alarming rate. The waiting lists for therapy had grown so long that some children were waiting over a year for help. She knew these weren't just numbers on a page. Behind each statistic was a child, perhaps sitting in their bedroom right now, feeling exactly the way she had felt when she was 12 years old. Walked to her private study, a room filled with family photographs and personal mementos that told the story of her journey from a middle-class girl from Berkshire to the future Queen of England. But tucked away in the bottom drawer of her antique desk was a small wooden box that held items from a much darker chapter of her past. She hadn't opened it in months, but today felt different. Today, she needed to remember. Inside the box were letters she had written but never sent, diary entries from her teenage years, and a small bracelet that had belonged to her best friend Emma. Emma, who had struggled with depression throughout their school years. Emma, who had tried to take her own life when they were both 16. Emma, who had survived that attempt but continued to battle demons that most people couldn't see or understand. The friendship with Emma had shaped in ways that few people realized. While other teenagers were worried about homework and weekend plans, had spent countless nights on the phone with Emma, talking her through panic attacks and dark thoughts. She had learned to recognize the signs when Emma was struggling, had become an expert at knowing exactly what to say and what not to say during those fragile moments. But the experience had also awakened something within herself. The constant stress of worrying about Emma, combined with the pressure of her own academic expectations and family responsibilities, had triggered her own battle with anxiety. She remembered the sleepless nights, the racing thoughts, the physical symptoms that no one could explain. Her parents had been loving but confused, unsure how to help their typically cheerful daughter who suddenly seemed to be drowning in worries that made no sense to them. The breaking point had come during her first year at university. The pressure of adjusting to life combined with years of suppressed anxiety, had finally overwhelmed her. She remembered sitting in her small dormitory room one October evening, feeling so disconnected from herself that she wondered if she was losing her mind. The walls seemed to be closing in, her breathing became shallow, and for the first time in her life, she understood exactly how Emma had felt all those years. That night, she had called her mother, barely able to speak through her tears. Her mother had driven through the night to reach her, and together they had found a counselor who specialized in anxiety disorders. It had taken months of therapy and a great deal of courage, but slowly had learned to manage her anxiety and understand that seeking help wasn't a sign of weakness. The irony wasn't lost on her that meeting William had actually happened during one of her lowest periods at university. She had been working hard on her recovery, learning coping strategies and building her confidence back up. When she walked down that runway in the charity fashion show where William first noticed her, she had been celebrating a personal milestone in her mental health journey. She was finally feeling like herself again, strong enough to put herself out there and take risks. But even as their relationship blossomed and she fell deeply in love with William, had never shared the full extent of her struggles with mental health. She had mentioned her friend Emma's difficulties, had talked about the importance of mental health awareness, but she had never told him about her own dark nights of the soul. As their relationship became more serious and public, she had worried about how the revelation might affect not only her own reputation, but also the monarchy's image. Now, years later, as she held the hospital report in her hands, realized that her silence might be doing more harm than good. Every week, she received letters from young people who were struggling with mental health issues. They wrote to her because they had heard about her charity work, because they sensed that somehow she understood. But they didn't know the real reason she understood. They didn't know that she had walked in their shoes, that she had felt the same crushing weight of anxiety and depression. The hospital report mentioned a particularly heartbreaking case of a 14-year-old girl named Sophie who had been admitted after a suicide attempt. Sophie's story was eerily similar to Emma's, and reading it had brought back a flood of memories that thought she had processed years ago. Sophie was bright, accomplished, and came from a loving family. On the surface, she had everything going for her. But beneath the smiling exterior, she was fighting a battle that no one could see. The hospital staff had noted that Sophie often asked about during her stay. She had apparently been following charity work and had told the nurses that the Princess of Wales was the only person in the royal family who seemed to really care about mental health. Sophie had even asked if there was any way she could write a letter, too, telling her how much it meant to have someone in such a prominent position speaking up for people like her. His assistant had mentioned receiving this request, along with dozens of others like it. But what struck most was the note the head of the psychiatric ward had included with Sophie's request. The doctor had written that, in her professional opinion, many of the young patients would benefit enormously from knowing that mental health struggles could affect anyone, regardless of their background or circumstances. She had specifically mentioned that having a role model who had overcome similar challenges could be incredibly powerful for young people who felt isolated and different. As sat in her study, surrounded by the trappings of her privileged life, she thought about the responsibility that came with her platform. She had always been careful, always been proper, always been mindful of her duty to the crown. But what if her greatest duty wasn't to maintain a perfect image, but rather to use her influence to help others who were suffering in silence? She thought about her own children, about the world they were growing up in. George, Charlotte, and Louis would face their own challenges as they grew older. The pressure of their royal heritage, the constant scrutiny, the expectations that came with their birthright, all of these factors could potentially impact their mental health. Wouldn't they benefit from having a mother who had modeled honesty and vulnerability about these issues? Reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the counselor who had helped her through her university struggles. They had stayed in touch over the years, with Dr. Mitchell providing occasional guidance when faced particularly stressful periods in royal life. But this call would be different. This time wasn't calling for herself. "Sarah," she said when the familiar voice answered, "I need your advice about something important. I'm thinking about sharing my story publicly, about my anxiety and the therapy that helped me. But I need to understand all the implications before I make this decision." Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment before responding. "That's a significant step. What's prompting you to consider this now?" As explained about the hospital reports, about Sophie and the other young people reaching out to her, she could hear the understanding in Dr. Mitchell's voice. They talked for nearly an hour, discussing the potential benefits and risks of such a revelation. Dr. Mitchell emphasized that story could indeed be powerful for young people, but only if she was sharing it for the right reasons and was prepared for the intense public scrutiny that would follow. After the call, felt both energized and terrified. She knew that once she opened this door, there would be no going back. The media would dissect every aspect of her past, would question her ability to handle royal duties, would probably speculate about her current mental state. But they would also have to acknowledge that mental health struggles were real, were common, and could affect anyone. She thought about Emma, who was now a successful teacher and had become an advocate for mental health awareness in schools. Emma had often told that she wished more prominent figures would share their stories, that the stigma around mental health would only disappear when people realized how many successful, accomplished individuals had faced similar struggles. As the afternoon wore on, found herself drafting and redrafting a speech in her mind. She imagined standing before an audience of young people, parents, and healthcare professionals, telling them about the scared university student she had once been. She pictured herself explaining how therapy had saved her life, how learning to manage anxiety had actually made her stronger, not weaker. But she also imagined the headlines that would follow, the questions about her fitness for royal duties, the speculation about whether she was still struggling. She thought about William's reaction, about how this revelation might affect their children, about whether the Queen and other senior royals would support such an unprecedented level of personal disclosure. The internal conflict was exhausting. On one hand, she had built her entire adult life around discretion and duty. On the other hand, she had never felt a calling as strongly as she felt this one. The image of Sophie and the other young people in that hospital ward kept returning to her thoughts. They were depending on adults to create a world where mental health was treated with the same importance as physical health. How could she continue to advocate for that world while keeping her own experience hidden? As evening approached, made her way to the nursery where her children were having their dinner. George, now old enough to understand some of the complexities of royal life, looked up at her with William's thoughtful eyes. Charlotte, spirited and confident, chattered about her day at school. And little Louis, still blissfully unaware of the weight his surname carried, giggled as he tried to feed himself. Looking at her children, realized that her decision wasn't just about helping other people's children. It was about creating a world where her own children would feel safe to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to acknowledge their struggles without fear of judgment. She wanted them to grow up knowing that strength came not from perfection, but from facing difficulties with honesty and grace. That night, as she and William sat together in their private sitting room, knew she had to begin the conversation that would change everything. She had spent years being the perfect royal wife, the flawless future queen. But perhaps it was time to be something even more valuable to the people she served. A real, flawed, recovering human being who had found her way through darkness and could help light the path for others. The decision was forming in her mind, gathering strength like a storm on the horizon. She would need time to plan, to prepare, to gather support from the right people. But for the first time in months, felt a sense of purpose that went beyond duty or obligation. She felt the calling to use her greatest pain to create her most meaningful contribution to the world. As she prepared for bed that night, looked once more at the hospital report sitting on her nightstand. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of transforming her private struggles into public advocacy. Tomorrow, she would start the journey towards sharing the story that could help save lives. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. The conversation with William that night was unlike any they had shared in their years of marriage. Had waited until the children were asleep, and their evening routines were complete before broaching the subject that had been consuming her thoughts all day. She found him in his study, reviewing documents related to his environmental initiatives, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across his familiar features. "William," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I need to talk to you about something important, something that could change how people see me, see us, and see our family." William looked up from his papers, immediately sensing the gravity in her voice. Over the years, he had learned to read moods and expressions better than anyone else could. Tonight, he saw a mixture of determination and vulnerability that reminded him of the young woman he had fallen in love with at university. Began by sharing the hospital report, explaining Sophie's story and the request to write to her. But then she took a deep breath and began to reveal the parts of her past that she had kept hidden, even from him. She told him about the extent of her anxiety struggles about the therapy sessions that had helped her rebuild her sense of self, about the nights when she had wondered if she was strong enough to handle the pressure of royal life. William listened without interruption, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that looked like admiration. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, processing the revelation that his wife had been carrying this burden alone for so many years. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked gently, reaching across the desk to take her hand. "All this time, I thought you were naturally resilient to all the pressure. I never realized you understood it from your own experience." Explained her fears about how the revelation might affect his family, his future reign, and their children's lives. She had worried that admitting to mental health struggles might be seen as a weakness that could undermine public confidence in the monarchy. But now, she was beginning to see that honesty might actually strengthen her ability to serve. The conversation continued late into the night, with William asking thoughtful questions about her therapy experience and her current mental health. He admitted that he had sometimes worried about her during particularly stressful periods, but had attributed her occasional withdrawal to the normal pressures of royal life. Learning about her deeper struggles actually helped him understand her better and appreciate the strength it had taken for her to navigate their life together. By the end of their conversation, William was not only supportive of her desire to share her story publicly, but eager to help her plan the best way to do so. He had always been passionate about mental health advocacy, having seen the impact of his mother's struggles and having dealt with his own grief after her death. The idea that could provide hope and understanding to young people facing similar battles resonated deeply with him. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of careful planning and consultation. Reached out to mental health professionals, communications experts, and trusted members of their staff to discuss the best approach for sharing her story. She also contacted Emma, her old friend who had been the catalyst for her own understanding of mental health issues. Emma was overjoyed to hear from and immediately agreed to meet for lunch at a quiet restaurant outside London. When they sat down together, was struck by how much Emma had changed since their school days. The troubled teenager had grown into a confident woman who spoke openly about her mental health journey and the work she was doing to help others. "I always wondered if you understood more than you let on," Emma said as shared her plans. "During all those nights when you talked me through my panic attacks, you seemed to know exactly what I was feeling. It makes sense now." Emma's support meant everything, too. Having someone who had known her before her royal life, someone who understood the reality of mental health struggles, provided validation that her instincts were correct. Emma also offered practical advice about how to discuss mental health in a way that would be helpful rather than potentially triggering for vulnerable individuals. They spent hours talking about the impact that prominent figures could have by sharing their stories. Emma described working with teenagers who felt hopeless about their futures, who believed that successful people had never experienced the kind of struggles they were facing. She emphasized how powerful it could be for young people to hear from someone they perceived as having a perfect life, that challenges were universal and recovery was possible. During this period, also began visiting the children's hospital more frequently, spending time with patients and their families in a more informal capacity than her usual royal visits. She wanted to understand better what these young people needed to hear, what kind of support would be most meaningful to them. On one particularly moving visit, she spent an afternoon with Sophie, the 14-year-old whose story had initially prompted its decision to consider sharing her own experience. Sophie was in a much better place emotionally, but still struggling with the shame and stigma around her mental health diagnosis. "I feel like I'm broken," Sophie confided to during their conversation. "Like there's something wrong with me that other people don't have. My parents try to understand, but they've never felt the way I feel. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be normal." Heart ached as she listened to Sophie echo thoughts she had harbored during her own darkest moments. She wanted desperately to tell Sophie that she understood, that she had felt exactly the same way, that recovery was not only possible, but could lead to a life of purpose and fulfillment. But she knew that revealing her personal experience in that moment wouldn't be appropriate or fair to Sophie, who deserved to have her own story heard without the distraction of revelation. Instead, focused on listening and offering the kind of support she wished someone had given her at that age. She talked about the importance of therapy, about the courage it took to ask for help, and about how mental health struggles didn't define a person's worth or potential. She also shared stories of other young people she had met who had overcome similar challenges, emphasizing that Sophie was far from alone in her experience. After the hospital visit, felt even more convinced that sharing her story was the right decision. She had seen firsthand how isolation and shame compounded mental health struggles, and she knew that her voice could help break down those barriers for countless young people. The planning process involved numerous meetings with palace communications staff, mental health experts, and even representatives from various charities focused on youth mental health. Everyone needed to understand the scope of what was proposing and help develop a strategy that would maximize the positive impact while minimizing potential risks. One of the most challenging aspects of the preparation was deciding how much detail to share about her personal experience. She wanted to be authentic and relatable without oversharing in a way that might be inappropriate for her position or unhelpful to her audience. Working with Dr. Mitchell and other mental health professionals, she developed an approach that would be honest about the reality of mental health struggles while focusing on hope, recovery, and the importance of seeking help. Also had to consider the timing of her revelation. Royal schedules were planned months and sometimes years in advance, and inserting such a significant personal disclosure required careful coordination. They ultimately decided that the announcement would be made during Mental Health Awareness Week, with giving a major speech at a youth mental health conference, followed by a series of interviews and written pieces. The weeks leading up to the announcement were filled with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Found herself revisiting her old journals and therapy notes, remembering details from her university years that she had successfully moved past, but would now need to discuss publicly. The process of preparing to be vulnerable on such a large scale was emotionally exhausting, but also oddly liberating. William was a constant source of support during this period, often staying up late with her as she practiced different versions of her speech or worked through her concerns about the public reaction. He helped her anticipate difficult questions and develop thoughtful responses that would be both honest and protective of their family's privacy. Their children, while too young to fully understand the implications of what was planning, sensed that something important was happening. George, in particular, seemed to pick up on the serious conversations his parents were having and asked several times if everything was okay. Reassured him that everything was fine while also beginning to introduce age-appropriate conversations about emotions and the importance of talking about feelings. As the date of the announcement approached, received unexpected support from other members of the royal family. The Queen, when briefed on plans, expressed admiration for her courage and emphasized that the monarchy's strength came from its ability to connect with and serve the people. Several other family members also reached out to offer their support and share their own experiences with mental health challenges within their extended family. The night before her speech, barely slept. She spent hours reviewing her notes and practicing in front of the mirror, trying to find the right balance between formality and intimacy in her delivery. She thought about Sophie and all the other young people who would be watching or reading about her speech in the days to come. She thought about Emma and the journey they had both traveled from their struggling teenage years to their current positions as advocates and supporters. Most of all, she thought about her own teenage self, the girl who had felt so alone and frightened during her darkest moments. She hoped that by sharing her story, she could reach back through time and offer that girl the understanding and hope she had needed to hear. If her willingness to be vulnerable could prevent even one young person from feeling as isolated as she had felt, then all the risk and discomfort would be worth it. As dawn broke over London, felt ready. She had spent weeks preparing not just her words but her heart for this moment. She knew that after today, she would be seen differently by the public, by the media, and perhaps even by her own family. But she also knew that she was about to embark on the most meaningful work of her life, using her platform to create understanding and hope for those who needed it most. The car that would take her to the conference center was scheduled to arrive in just a few hours. By evening, the world would know a side of the Princess of Wales that had never been revealed before. The perfect royal facade would be replaced by something more valuable, the honest voice of someone who had survived her struggles and was ready to help others do the same. The morning of the speech dawned gray and drizzly, matching the nervous energy that felt coursing through her body as she prepared for what would become the most important day of her public life. She had chosen a simple navy dress, wanting her appearance to convey approachability rather than formality. As her stylist worked on her hair and makeup, reviewed her speech notes one final time, though by now she knew every word by heart. The venue for her announcement was the Royal Festival Hall, where hundreds of mental health advocates, young people, parents, and healthcare professionals had gathered for the annual Youth Mental Health Conference. Had specifically requested to speak at this event because she wanted her message to reach the people who needed to hear it most, rather than making her revelation through traditional royal channels. As her car pulled up to the venue, could see the crowds of media gathered outside. News of her upcoming speech had generated significant interest, though most reporters still believed she would be delivering a standard royal address about mental health awareness. None of them suspected that she was about to share the most personal details of her life with the world. Inside the building, met with conference organizers and some of the young people who would be in her audience. Among them was a 17-year-old who had struggled with depression and anxiety since his early teens, but was now studying to become a counselor himself. His story reminded of her own journey from struggle to advocacy. "Thank you for being here today," said as he shook her hand. "Having someone like you speaking about these issues makes such a difference. Sometimes adults don't really understand what we're going through." Smiled, knowing that in just a few minutes would discover exactly how well she understood. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. Throughout her royal career, she had been praised for her empathy and ability to connect with people facing mental health challenges. What the public hadn't realized was that her understanding came from personal experience rather than just compassion. Backstage, took a moment to center herself before walking onto the platform. She thought about her conversation with Dr. Mitchell the previous evening, during which her former therapist had reminded her that vulnerability required courage, but could also create the deepest connections with others. She thought about William, who was watching from the royal box with barely contained pride and anxiety. She thought about her children, who were at school but would someday understand the significance of what their mother had done today. When was introduced, the applause was warm and respectful, the kind of reception she had grown accustomed to during her years of public service. But as she approached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces before her, she knew that the next 20 minutes would change everything. She began her speech with the traditional acknowledgments and expressions of gratitude that were expected at such events. But then, taking a deep breath that seemed to echo through the microphone, she departed from royal convention in a way that left the audience stunned. "Today, I want to share something with you that I have never spoken about publicly before," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I want to tell you about a time in my life when I struggled with anxiety and depression, when I felt lost and afraid, and when I needed help to find my way back to hope." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. In the royal box, William leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. In the audience, young people who had been fidgeting moments before now sat perfectly still, hanging on every word. Even the media representatives, who had been quietly typing on their phones, stopped to listen with their full attention. Went on to describe her university years, speaking honestly about the panic attacks that had left her gasping for breath in her dormitory room, the sleepless nights when her mind raced with worries that felt insurmountable, and the day when she had finally reached out for professional help. She talked about the shame she had initially felt about needing therapy, the fear that others would see her as weak or broken if they knew about her struggles. "I remember sitting in my therapist's office for the first time, convinced that I was fundamentally different from other people," she shared. "I thought that successful, happy people didn't experience the kind of anxiety and despair that I was feeling. I thought that admitting I needed help was the same as admitting defeat." As spoke, she could see the impact her words were having on her audience. Young people were nodding in recognition, some with tears in their eyes. Parents in the audience looked surprised but also relieved, perhaps realizing that their own children's struggles were more common than they had understood. Mental health professionals seemed energized by the validation that their work was receiving from such a prominent platform. Described the therapy process in terms that were both honest and hopeful. She talked about learning coping strategies, understanding the root causes of her anxiety, and gradually rebuilding her confidence and sense of self. She emphasized that recovery wasn't a straight line, that there had been setbacks and difficult days even after she began to feel better. Some people might wonder how someone who struggled with mental health challenges could take on the responsibilities that come with royal life, she acknowledged. "The truth is that learning to manage my anxiety actually prepared me for this role in ways I never could have imagined. Therapy taught me resilience, empathy, and the importance of asking for help when I need it. These are skills that serve me every day, both in my public duties and as a mother." The most powerful moment of her speech came when she directly addressed the young people in her audience. "If you are struggling with mental health challenges, please know that you are not alone, you are not broken, and you are not without hope," she said, her voice becoming more emotional as she continued. "I want you to know that someone who stands before you today as a wife, mother, and member of the royal family has walked the same dark paths that you might be walking right now. And I want you to know that with help, with support, and with time, you can find your way back to the light." Concluded her speech by announcing a new initiative that she and William would be launching together. The program would provide increased funding for youth mental health services, training for teachers and parents to recognize signs of mental health struggles, and resources for young people to access help more quickly and easily. But more than that, she committed to continuing to share her story and use her platform to advocate for those who were still fighting their own battles. The response to her speech was immediate and overwhelming. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes, with many people openly crying as they applauded. On social media, her words began trending within minutes, with thousands of young people sharing their own stories and thanking her for her courage in speaking out. The 17-year-old who had greeted her earlier was among the first to approach her after the speech. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "You just changed everything for so many of us. Knowing that you understand that you've been where we are, it makes such a difference." But not everyone's response was immediately positive. As left the venue and headed to her next engagement, news reports were already beginning to analyze and critique her revelation. Some commentators questioned whether it was appropriate for a future queen to admit to mental health struggles. Others wondered about the timing of her announcement and whether it was connected to any current difficulties in her life. The palace communications team had anticipated these reactions, and had prepared responses that emphasized strength in overcoming her challenges and her commitment to helping others do the same. But still, reading some of the initial media coverage was difficult for her, who had known that opening herself up to such scrutiny would be one of the costs of her honesty. Most challenging moment came during her next appointment, a visit to a different hospital where she was scheduled to meet with staff and patients. As her car pulled up to the building, she could see protesters gathered outside with signs reading, "Unfit for royal duty," and "Queens don't have breakdowns." The sight of the hostile demonstration made her chest tighten with familiar anxiety, but she forced herself to take the deep breathing techniques she had learned years ago and continue with her scheduled visit. Inside the hospital, however, the reception was entirely different. Staff members approached her with newfound respect and gratitude, sharing their own experiences with mental health challenges and thanking her for bringing attention to issues they dealt with every day. Patients, particularly the younger ones, seemed to connect with her in a way they never had before, asking questions about her therapy experience and sharing their own struggles more openly than they typically would with royal visitors. Dr. Jennifer, the head of the hospital's psychiatric unit, pulled aside during the visit. "What you did today will save lives," she said firmly. "I've been working in mental health for 20 years, and I've never seen young patients respond to anyone the way they're responding to you right now. They see hope in your story that they've never been able to find before." As the day progressed, the initial shock and criticism began to give way to a more thoughtful public discourse about mental health and the royal family's role in addressing social issues. Support began pouring in from mental health organizations, other public figures who had faced similar struggles, and thousands of ordinary people who felt seen and understood by honesty. Emma called that evening, having watched the speech online from her classroom where she had been preparing for her next group of students. "I'm so proud of you," she said through tears. "Watching you up there, being so brave and honest about everything we went through, it brought back so many memories, but mostly it filled me with hope for all the young people who needed to hear exactly what you said today." That night, as sat with William reviewing the day's events and the flood of responses her speech had generated, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The perfect royal image she had maintained for years was gone, replaced by something more complex but ultimately more authentic. She had opened herself up to criticism and judgment, but she had also opened the door for thousands of people to feel less alone in their struggles. "No matter what happens next," William said as they prepared for bed, "what you did today was extraordinary. You used your pain to help heal others, and that takes a kind of courage that most people never have to find." Knew that the real work was just beginning. Her speech had been only the first step in what would become a lifelong commitment to mental health advocacy. There would be more criticism, more scrutiny, and undoubtedly more challenges ahead. But for the first time since she had become a member of the royal family, she felt like she was using her position for something that truly mattered to her personally. As she fell asleep that night, thought about Sophie and Emma and all the other people whose lives might be different because of what had happened that day. The scared university student she had once been felt like a distant memory, but that girl's pain had ultimately led to this moment of purpose and connection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight felt proud of the courage it had taken to transform her greatest struggle into her most meaningful contribution to the world. The weeks following's groundbreaking speech brought a whirlwind of reactions that shifted almost daily as the public, media, and royal establishment processed the implications of her revelation. What began as shock and controversy gradually transformed into something unprecedented, a genuine conversation about mental health that crossed social, economic, and cultural boundaries. The first major indication of the speech's impact came from an unexpected source. Within 48 hours of its announcement, mental health helplines across the United Kingdom reported a surge in calls from young people seeking support. The Samaritans noted a 300% increase in contacts from teenagers, with many specifically mentioning story as the reason they had finally reached out for help. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, former therapist who had advised her throughout the preparation process, called with remarkable news. "I've had calls from colleagues across the country. Therapy practices that typically have waiting lists of months are seeing an unprecedented demand for services. But more importantly, the stigma that usually surrounds these requests seems to have diminished overnight. People are approaching mental health treatment with a sense of hope rather than shame." The professional response was overwhelmingly positive. The Royal College of Psychiatrists issued a statement praising courage and emphasizing the importance of prominent figures sharing their mental health experiences. Medical schools reported increased applications for psychiatry and psychology programs, with many applicants citing speech as inspiration for their career choices. However, the political and media response remained complex and sometimes harsh. Several conservative commentators continued to question whether this revelation was appropriate for someone in her position. A particularly scathing editorial in one major newspaper suggested that the royal family should maintain traditional boundaries between public service and personal disclosure. The criticism stung, but found unexpected strength in the overwhelmingly positive response from the people her story was meant to help. Letters and emails poured into Kensington Palace from across the globe, many from young people sharing their own struggles and thanking her for making them feel less alone. One letter from a 16-year-old girl named particularly moved. "Your Royal Highness," had written, "I have been struggling with anxiety for 3 years. I always felt like there was something wrong with me because I couldn't handle things that seemed easy for other people. When I heard your speech, I cried for the first time in months. Not because I was sad, but because I finally understood that having anxiety doesn't make me weak or broken. If someone as strong and successful as you could go through the same thing and come out okay, then maybe I can too. Yesterday, I asked my parents to help me find a therapist. Thank you for giving me hope." Showed the letter to William that evening, and he could see how profoundly it affected her. "This is why you did it," he said simply. "For every critic in the media, there are hundreds of young people like whose lives you've potentially changed." The international response was equally significant. Mental health organizations in other countries began reaching out to STEAM, requesting her involvement in their own awareness campaigns. The World Health Organization invited her to become a special ambassador for global youth mental health initiatives. Foreign royals and political leaders shared their own experiences with mental health challenges, citing courage as inspiration for their own openness. 3 weeks after the speech, received a phone call that brought her to tears. Sophie, the 14-year-old patient whose story had initially prompted its decision to go public, was calling from her home where she was continuing her recovery. "I wanted you to know that I'm doing much better," Sophie said, her voice stronger than remembered from their hospital meeting. "After I heard about your speech, I felt like someone important finally understood what I was going through. My therapist says I've made more progress in the last 3 weeks than I did in the previous 3 months. I think it's because I don't feel ashamed anymore." Sophie went on to explain that she had started a mental health awareness group at her school, inspired by his example of using personal experience to help others. The group had already attracted dozens of students and had received support from teachers and parents who were grateful to have a forum for addressing these issues. The ripple effects of revelation continued to expand in ways she had never anticipated. Schools across the country began implementing new mental health curricula, many of them using story as a case study in resilience and recovery. Universities started offering improved mental health services for students, acknowledging that even high-achieving individuals could struggle with anxiety and depression. Perhaps most significantly, other public figures began sharing their own mental health stories. Athletes, actors, politicians, and business leaders started speaking openly about their struggles, creating a cascade effect that normalized conversations about mental health in ways that had never been seen before. The royal family's response evolved as well. Initially, there had been concerns about how this revelation might affect the monarchy's reputation. But as the positive impact became clear, senior royals began to express pride in courage and the meaningful work she was doing. The Queen herself made a rare personal statement, saying that willingness to share her story the best traditions of royal service and compassion. Prince Harry called from his home in California, where he had been following the story closely. "I'm incredibly proud of you," he told during their conversation. "You've done something that I always wanted to do but never found the courage for. You've shown that being vulnerable can be a source of strength, not weakness." The conversation with Harry led to an unexpected development. He began collaborating with William on a joint mental health initiative that would bridge their different approaches to advocacy. Despite the tensions that had existed between the couples, their shared commitment to mental health awareness created an opportunity for healing and cooperation. As autumn approached, schedule became busier than ever, but with a focus that felt deeply meaningful to her. She visited schools across the country, speaking with students about mental health and encouraging them to seek help when they needed it. She met with parents and teachers, helping them understand how to recognize and respond to mental health challenges in young people. One of the most powerful moments came during a visit to her old university standing in the very dormitory where she had experienced her worst anxiety attacks, spoke to current students about the importance of seeking help and the resources available to them. Many students in the audience were visibly moved, and several approached her afterward to share their own struggles and thank her for her honesty. "Being back here brings back so many memories," told the students. "Some of them are difficult memories of times when I felt overwhelmed and frightened, but they're also reminders of how far I've come and how much help is available for anyone who's willing to reach out for it." The university announced that it would be establishing a new mental health center in Sonner, funded by donations that had poured in following her speech. The center would provide comprehensive mental health services to students and serve as a training facility for future mental health professionals. Its advocacy work also led to significant policy changes. The government announced increased funding for youth mental health services, shorter waiting times for therapy appointments, and mandatory mental health training for teachers. These changes, directly influenced by the public conversation had sparked, represented the kind of systemic improvements she had hoped to achieve. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was seen in individual families across the country. Parents reported having more open conversations with their children about emotions and mental health. Young people felt more comfortable seeking help when they were struggling. The shame and stigma that had historically surrounded mental health issues began to diminish, replaced by understanding and compassion. Emma visited at Kensington Palace that autumn, bringing her own daughter, who was now 12 years old. As they walked through the gardens where often found peace during stressful times, Emma reflected on how much had changed since their school days. "When we were teenagers, I felt so alone with my struggles," Emma said. "I thought I was the only one who felt that way, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. What you've done has made it so that my daughter and her generation won't have to feel that isolation. They'll grow up knowing that mental health challenges are common, treatable, and nothing to be ashamed of." His own children were beginning to understand the significance of their mother's work. George, now old enough to grasp some of the complexities, asked thoughtful questions about why mental health was important and how they could help friends who might be struggling. Charlotte and Louis, while still young, were growing up in a household where emotions were discussed openly and seeking help was presented as a sign of strength. The family had also made changes to their own routines to prioritize mental health. They instituted regular family meetings where everyone could share their feelings and concerns. They established screen-free times for meaningful conversations. Most importantly, they modeled the kind of emotional openness that hoped to see throughout society. As the one-year anniversary of her speech approached, reflected on how profoundly her life had changed. The fear and anxiety she had felt before going public had been replaced by a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she had never experienced before. The work was challenging and sometimes emotionally draining, but it felt authentic in a way that her previous royal duties, while important, had not. The numbers spoke for themselves. Mental health service utilization among young people had increased dramatically. Suicide rates among teenagers had begun to decline for the first time in years. Applications to mental health training programs had doubled, but beyond the statistics, could see the change in individual faces, in the young people who approached her with confidence rather than shame when discussing their mental health. Standing in her study one evening, looking at the same wooden box that had contained her old diary entries and letters, realized that those painful memories had become the foundation for the most meaningful work of her life. The scared university student she had once been would have been amazed to see how her struggles could ultimately help so many others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new young people to meet and inspire, new policies to advocate for and implement. But tonight felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her willingness to be vulnerable had created ripple effects that would continue long after her speech was forgotten. The conversation about mental health that she had started would continue to grow and evolve, creating a world where future generations would never have to face their struggles alone. 2 years after his groundbreaking speech, the landscape of mental health awareness in Britain had transformed beyond recognition. What had begun as one woman's courageous decision to share her personal struggles had evolved into a national movement that touched every aspect of society. As prepared for the second annual Youth Mental Health Conference, where she would deliver the keynote address, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The venue was once again the Royal Festival Hall, but this year the building buzzed with an energy that felt different from that first tentative gathering. The conference had grown from a few hundred attendees to over 1,000, with participants traveling from across Europe and beyond to be part of what had become a landmark event in the mental health calendar. In the green room before her speech, met with some of the young people whose lives had been changed by the movement that her revelation had sparked. The 17-year-old who had been studying to become a counselor when they first met was now enrolled in university and working part-time at a mental health charity. Sophie, the 14-year-old whose suicide attempt had initially moved to action, was now 16 and had become a peer mentor for other young people struggling with mental health challenges. "I wanted to show you this," Sophie said, handing a thick folder filled with letters. "These are from students at schools across the country who have joined mental health awareness groups like the one I started. There are over 200 schools participating now, and they all say it started because they heard about your speech and wanted to make a difference in their own communities." Flipped through the letters, reading testimonials from teenagers who had found hope, parents who had learned to support their struggling children, and teachers who had gained new tools for helping their students. Each letter represented a life that had been touched by the ripple effects of her decision to be vulnerable in public. But the changes extended far beyond individual stories. The policy initiatives that had advocated for had led to concrete improvements in mental health services across the country. Waiting times for child and adolescent mental health services had been cut in half. Every school in England now had at least one staff member trained in mental health first aid. University counseling services had tripled their capacity, and many had introduced peer support programs modeled on the approach that had championed. The international impact had been equally remarkable, had been invited to speak at mental health conferences in over 20 countries, and several nations had implemented policy changes inspired by the British model. The World Health Organization had appointed her as a global ambassador for youth mental health, a role that allowed her to influence mental health policy on a worldwide scale. But perhaps the most significant change had been in the royal family itself. This example had encouraged other members of the family to speak more openly about their own struggles and experiences. William had begun sharing his own story about dealing with grief after his mother's death, and together they had created what many saw as a more relatable and human monarchy. Prince Charles, initially concerned about how revelation might affect the family's reputation, had become one of her strongest supporters after seeing the positive impact of her work. During a private dinner at Clarence's house, he had told that her courage in addressing mental health had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the monarchy needed for the modern era. "You've shown that strength doesn't come from appearing perfect," he had said. "It comes from being honest about our vulnerabilities and using them to help others. That's the essence of true service." The Queen herself had made several public statements supporting mental health awareness, often referencing this work as an example of how the royal family could address the challenges facing modern society. At the previous year's Christmas broadcast, she had specifically mentioned the importance of mental health and the need to support those who were struggling. As prepared to take the stage for her keynote address, she thought about how much her relationship with her royal duties had evolved. In the early years of her marriage, she had sometimes felt like she was playing a role, carefully maintaining an image that met public expectations. But now, her work felt authentic and deeply personal, rooted in her genuine desire to help others overcome the same challenges she had faced. Her speech that day was different from the one she had given 2 years earlier. Where the first had been a revelation, this one was a celebration of progress and a call for continued action. She spoke about the young people she had met whose lives had been saved by early intervention and proper mental health support. She highlighted the teachers and parents who had learned to recognize the signs of mental health struggles and respond with compassion rather than judgment. "When I first shared my story 2 years ago, I was terrified," told the audience. "I worried about how people would see me, whether they would think less of me for admitting that I had struggled. What I discovered instead was that vulnerability creates connection, that honesty builds trust, and that sharing our struggles can be the first step in helping others overcome their own." She went on to announce several new initiatives, including a global research project on youth mental health that would be funded by donations from around the world. The project would study the most effective interventions for young people struggling with mental health challenges and develop evidence-based programs that could be implemented in communities everywhere. Also revealed that she and William would be establishing a foundation focused specifically on mental health advocacy, separate from their other charitable work. The foundation would provide funding for mental health research, support for community-based programs, and resources for families dealing with mental health challenges. But the most emotional moment of her speech came when she invited several young people to join her on stage. These were individuals whose lives had been directly impacted by the mental health movement that her revelation had sparked. They included former patients who had become advocates, students who had started mental health programs at their schools, and young professionals who had chosen careers in mental health because of the inspiration they had found in Story. Among them was the 16-year-old who had written to after her first speech. Now 18 and about to start university, had become a powerful advocate for mental health awareness among young people. She had spoken at conferences, written articles for youth magazines, and helped develop a mental health curriculum that was being used in schools across the country. 3 years ago, I thought my anxiety made me weak and different, told the audience. I was ashamed of my struggles and convinced that successful people didn't face the same challenges I was facing. When shared her story, it changed everything for me. I realized that seeking help wasn't a sign of failure, it was a sign of courage. And I learned that my experiences, as difficult as they were, could actually be used to help other people. The response to second major speech was even more overwhelmingly positive than the first had been. Social media erupted with messages of support and gratitude from around the world. Mental health organizations praised the continued commitment and leadership she was showing. Political leaders from across the spectrum acknowledged the importance of her work and pledged to support the initiatives she had announced. But for the most meaningful responses came from the individuals whose lives had been changed. Over the following weeks, she received thousands of letters and emails from people sharing their own stories of recovery, their gratitude for her advocacy, and their commitment to continuing the work she had started. One letter that particularly moved her came from a mother whose teenage son had attempted suicide 2 years earlier. The woman wrote that speech had given her the courage to seek help for her son and had helped reduce the shame and stigma the family had felt about his mental health struggles. The son was now thriving in college and planning a career in psychology, inspired by the idea that his own experiences could be used to help others. Another letter came from a teacher who had initially been skeptical of the focus on mental health in schools, but had become convinced of its importance after attending one of speaking events. The teacher had since become a mental health first aid instructor and had helped identify and support dozens of students who were struggling with mental health challenges. As autumn turned to winter, schedule remained packed with mental health-related engagements. She visited schools and universities, spoke at conferences and workshops, met with researchers and policymakers, and continued to share her story with audiences around the world. Each engagement brought new stories of hope and recovery, new evidence of the impact that open conversations about mental health could have. The work was sometimes emotionally challenging, as regularly met with young people who were in the midst of serious mental health crises. But it was also incredibly rewarding, as she was able to see firsthand how her willingness to be vulnerable had created space for others to seek help and find healing. During the holiday season, received an unexpected gift. Emma, her old friend whose struggles had first opened eyes to mental health issues, had compiled a scrapbook of articles, letters, and photographs documenting the impact of advocacy work. The final page contained a simple note. "Thank you for turning our pain into purpose. The scared teenagers we once were could never have imagined that their struggles would someday help so many others find hope." As looked through the scrapbook with William and their children on Christmas Eve, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this point. The decision to share her story had been one of the most difficult of her life, but it had also been one of the most meaningful. She had discovered that her greatest vulnerability could become her greatest strength, that her deepest pain could be transformed into her most powerful purpose. George, now old enough to understand much of what his mother had accomplished, looked up from the scrapbook with admiration in his eyes. "Mum, you've helped so many people. Are you proud of what you've done?" Consider the question carefully before answering. "I'm proud that we were able to create something good from something difficult," she said. But mostly I'm grateful that so many brave young people were willing to share their own stories and seek help when they needed it. That's what really made the difference. As the year came to a close, looked forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. There was still so much work to be done, so many young people who needed support, so many barriers to break down and stigmas to overcome. But she also knew that the movement she had helped to start had taken on a life of its own, powered by the courage and determination of countless individuals who had chosen to turn their struggles into sources of strength. The scared university student she had once been felt like a distant memory, but carried that young woman's pain and hope with her every day. It was a reminder of how far she had come and how much further there was still to go. Most importantly, it was proof that even our greatest challenges could be transformed into our most meaningful contributions to the world, that vulnerability could be a source of power, and that sharing our stories could light the way for others walking similar paths. In her final diary entry of the year, wrote, "I never imagined that the darkest period of my life would become the foundation for the work I'm most proud of. But I've learned that sometimes our greatest gifts to the world come not from our strengths, but from our willingness to transform our struggles into sources of hope for others." The conversation we started continues to grow and evolve, and I'm honored to be part of creating a world where no young person has to face their mental health challenges alone.